Hi, my name is Glenn Valentine. I'm with the Rhode Island Firearm Owners League, resident of the town of East Greenwich. So someone here earlier today had mentioned this idea of approaching this from a sort of non-anecdotal position or approach to this. And so a number of years ago, immediately after the Newtown massacre, a group of us from our organization decided that we were going to try and provide some data specific to the state of Rhode Island and provide this snapshot of what exactly is happening in the state with respect to firearms, as opposed to focusing on some of these situations where we try and connect this causation versus correlation in places where it in fact isn't Rhode Island. So we have our own set of issues that we think should be debated when we're considering legislation, any sort of restrictive legislation. So we submitted a series of requests to the city of Providence because they make up the bulk of the firearms charges in the state that actually involve shootings. They make about a third of the firearms based on a state uniform crime report, and they make up about 90% of the actual shootings. So we took every single arrest report for the last 4 years we're finishing now, and we went through every single line and categorized all of the charges, all of the types of firearms, the capacities of those firearms, and whether those people were permitted to have those firearms that they in fact were arrested with. And we found that the overwhelming majority of these legislative initiatives, specifically today the magazine capacity restrictions, are completely misaligned to what they find people being arrested with. And I certainly don't want to go on forever. I have plenty of statistics I can forward to you folks, but 9 out of 10 times the magazine is not a factor. Most of the firearms that they seize in the city of Providence have no means to accept a large capacity magazine as defined by the legislation, or their revolvers. And in the police chief's own quoting the police chief from a Providence Journal article they did a number of years ago, he said the weapon of choice was the revolver. But unfortunately, this impacts the folks who walk into a gun shop on a daily basis to purchase a firearm for self-defense. Most of the firearms that people choose for self-defense exceed 10 rounds. And so this would severely limit the number of firearms that you would have, that you would choose for self-defense. One of the other things we found in these reports was that not one person, and I'm not talking figuratively, literally not one person had a license to carry a firearm. Every last person that was arrested for the last 4 years outside of the home in the city of Providence and was charged with had no permit, but was arrested with a handgun, violated 1147-8A, so they had no permit to possess that firearm. Yet again, we see this idea of schools, and I am a teacher, in fact, and I'm not concerned with this idea of parents walking onto a baseball field with a firearm. It's never been a concern of mine because it's never happened. We've seen in Providence, not one person had a permit to carry a firearm, so there's a history there of gun owners and permitted people to carry firearms being well behaved. With respect to this bill that is set to sort of revamp the process to apply for a permit, we submitted a request a number of years ago based on the number of complaints that people had about permitting. And I won't get into all the details, but I do have a copy of the testimony where we requested 5 things from every municipality: what the permitting process was, a copy of the application, who is the issuing authority, how many permits they had issued, how many permits they had denied, and so on and so forth. We found that there were departments that still continued to not have applications after the court had ordered a few towns to do so. We found that some towns claimed that they had no application to constituents that had asked, but yet when we pressed them with a records request, they actually had active permits. Some towns continue to require a psychological evaluation. And in one case, and I made copies of the entire timeline of what happened to this particular individual that approached us, he confronted the chief with a letter that we had obtained from the University of Rhode Island, which was required as part of his permit application process, which stated no such tests exist. And the police chief put in writing that though he's aware of the fact that the test does not exist, he continues to require that. So in addition to a few other towns that require things like waivers, that have banking information and credit information, it's time to have some sort of reform associated with the permitting process. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative McEntee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. How many rounds are in a large capacity magazine?
As defined by this legislation, it would be anything over 10 rounds.
But what is,
in my opinion?
In your opinion, in your experience?
Right. As a shooter, and I'm a fairly experienced shooter. I'm an instructor, and I've got quite a bit of training, maybe not on par with most officers, but a decent amount of training. And so for me, this idea of a 100-round magazine doesn't really fit into my what I own for a firearm. But most of the firearms that I've purchased have 15, 16, 17, 20 rounds, and that's just standard capacity. And this idea that, and this goes back to an FBI report on the Dade County massacre where individuals were shot 14 and 15 times by officers and still managed to kill 4 officers. And so percentage-wise, it's typically between 16 and 20% for an officer in terms of proficiency in a shooting, and that's documented. FBI, this is what they based the larger capacity firearms, the larger capacity handguns that they choose. So to think that if you're attacked by 1, 2, or 3 people, the odds are, in terms of your success with that, it is certainly going to exceed the 10 rounds of the firearm.
I'm just wondering I just want the definition, a large capacity magazine. How many is that?
There is no definition in terms of this state currently. There is no definition for that. It's an arbitrary number that was chosen back during the days of the Clinton administration when they pressed this bill.
But they can go up to 100 rounds. Is that what you said?
There's. Sure. I mean, it's typically, with a handgun, it's typically between anywhere from 7 to 15 or 16.
Thank you.
Sure.